Everything seemed normal until it wasn't. It was just another ordinary day in the life of this woman and her Shih Tzu, a sweet little dog with sweet eyes and soft fur. They had always been very close, but that day something was different, and she couldn't explain it. The dog, who had previously run happily around the house, now walked slowly, silently, as if something was on his mind. He didn't want to play. He didn't want his favorite treats. He just wanted to be close to her. More than ever. Wherever she went, he followed. If she sat, he lay at her feet. If she lay down, he jumped on the bed and pressed himself against her belly, right next to her. He slept there, as if protecting something. But what? She didn't know. She just felt something strange in the air. An exaggerated care, a silence full of meaning, a strange affection. And then came the looks. That serious, deep look, as if the Shih Tzu wanted to say something, a kind of concern she'd never seen in him. And the most curious thing, he started sniffing her belly, several times. He'd nuzzle her and stand there, quiet, as if listening to a secret. It was such a small gesture, but so strange it was impossible to ignore. At that moment, she still had no idea what was coming, but the Shih Tzu already knew. In some way no one can explain, he had already sensed the biggest change that was about to happen in her life. And he was trying to warn her, in his own way, silently, with love. This story is true, and what happens next is simply thrilling. He's always been an affectionate dog, the kind that loves to be held, snuggles on the couch, and wags his tail at the mere sound of his owner's voice. But a few days ago, something changed. And it wasn't just any change. It was as if he'd activated an invisible alert, a radar only he could sense. The Shih Tzu began behaving in a way that even she couldn't explain. Before, he was just the right amount of affectionate. He'd give her space when she needed it, go, play alone, and sleep in his bed without a problem. But now, he didn't care about distance anymore. He was glued to her constantly, literally. If she got up to go to the bathroom, he followed. If she went to the kitchen, there he was, following her every step like a four-legged shadow. It wasn't just company. It was insistence. An almost urgent need to be close. The most curious thing was the way he positioned himself beside her. It wasn't random. He always lay the same way, against her belly, sometimes with his head, sometimes just with his whole body curled up, as if trying to protect something there. And that started to draw attention. He'd never had this habit before. It was almost instinctive, as if he were hearing a whisper coming from within her. The affection also became more intense. He licked her face more, looked into her eyes more, and seemed to be trying to speak with that deep, attentive gaze. It wasn't just love. It was a different kind of urgency, as if to say, "I'm here and I'll take care of you." At night, the change was even more noticeable. Before, he slept in his own little bed, or at the foot of the bed. Now, he only wanted to sleep next to her. If she changed position, he did too. He followed every movement as if on alert, and even while asleep, he always seemed to have one eye open, watching. The owner found it all very cute, of course, but she also began to wonder why. Was he afraid of something? Was he in pain? Anxious? But no. He seemed calm, balanced, just different. Very different. There was one day in particular that stuck in her memory. She was lying on the couch watching TV, and he jumped on her lap, curled up against her belly, and let out a deep sigh. Then he closed his eyes and lay there, motionless, as if to say, "It's safe here." It shook her, because deep down, she too was feeling something she couldn't explain. A strange tiredness, a heightened sensitivity. But she thought it was just stress. As the days passed, this new version of the Shih Tzu only intensified. He became more observant, calmer, and more attached. And most impressively, he seemed to know exactly when she needed attention. If she felt sad, he would come closer. If she cried watching a movie, he would nuzzle her face. He was always there, present, attentive. It was at that moment that she began to wonder if there was something bigger behind it all. Because the Shih Tzu's affection wasn't just affection anymore, it was almost a message. A silent way of saying, I know something you don't yet, and I'm here to take care of it. She still had no idea what was happening to her own body, but that little dog, so small and full of love, seemed to already know. And he was warning her, in his own way, with too much affection, with too much presence, with a kind of love that only animals and perhaps angels know how to give. Looking at that Shih Tzu was different. His eyes had always been bright, full of life, with that mischievous look of someone who gets up to mischief and then pretends to be innocent. But now, there was something new there, a different glow, deep, almost serious. And that look began to catch his owner's attention, as if the dog were trying to speak. Without barking, without growling, without making a fuss, just with his eyes. It was as if he were watching her every gesture, every sigh, every step. When she sat down, he stared. When she walked around the house, he followed her with his eyes even, before she stood up. It was a kind of connection difficult to explain, a feeling that came from that still, silent gaze, but full of intentions. The most impressive thing was that that look wasn't one of fear. It wasn't distrust. It was protection, pure and true. It was as if he were saying, I know something's up, and I'll take care of you. And that feeling grew stronger every day. One day she was brushing her hair in the mirror and noticed him watching her from the floor, motionless. His head slightly tilted, unblinking. She laughed and asked aloud, "What's wrong, my love?" But he didn't react. He just kept staring, his eyes fixed on her, as if he knew that moment, however simple it seemed, was important. The other day, as she fell asleep on the couch, she woke with a strange feeling. And there he was, sitting close to her face, looking at her with that same look. He didn't even bark. He just watched, as if to say, "It's okay, I'm here." It was a look that brought peace and, at the same time, awakened a certain mystery. The family started to notice too. "That dog is watching you too much," the sister said at Sunday lunch. Everyone laughed, but deep down, she knew it was true. He looked different, and that look was real. She tried to ignore it. She thought it was all in her head. Maybe she was overly sensitive, but the dog's eyes persisted. They looked with a calmness that soothed, with a firmness that protected, with a depth that said more than any words. And the more that gaze appeared, the more she felt something new happening inside her, a feeling that still had no name, a slight discomfort in her body, an unusual tiredness, but at the same time, a strange intuition, as if everything were about to change. And the Shih Tzu kept watching, every day, all the time. When she showered, he'd stand at the bathroom door waiting. When she left for work, he'd watch her until the last crack of the door closed. When she returned, he didn't run like before. He just stared at her, as if to confirm that everything was okay. It was impossible to ignore. He knew. Somehow he knew. His eyes were speaking, and even if she didn't fully understand, deep in her heart, she felt it. He was there for a greater reason. And that look? It wasn't just love. It was care. It was intuition. It was a furry soul trying to protect another before it even understood from what. It was around the second week that she began to notice something even more curious. Until then, I thought the Shih Tzu was just needier, perhaps wanting attention. But suddenly, other changes began to appear, and this time, it wasn't just in his affectionate behavior or his looks. It was in his daily life, his routine, the little things that were part of that puppy's happy personality. Everything started to get out of hand. Appetite was the first sign. The Shih Tzu, who used to run as soon as he heard the sound of the food bowl, now seemed disinterested. He would approach the bowl, sniff it, give it a lick or two, and then quickly move away. He wasn't sick, at least he didn't show any physical signs, but he was different, and that worried her. She thought it was just a phase, Maybe he was getting tired of the food. She even changed brands, added a little shredded chicken, and gave him special treats. But even so, he wasn't eating with the same joy as before. He seemed to have lost interest. And instead of waiting for the bowl, he preferred to lie down, his eyes attentive to her, observing everything. Then came the change in his sleep. Before he slept at regular times, naps after lunch, afternoon naps on the living room rug, and at night, he curled up in his little bed near her bed. Now he slept at different times. Sometimes he would spend the whole day drowsy, and other times he seemed to not sleep at all. He would just lie there, eyes half open, watching her. His play routine also suffered. His favorite ball, which always provided hours of fun, was forgotten in a corner. The walks he loved so much were now rejected. She would call him, put on his leash, and he simply wouldn't go. He would stop at the door, look at her with those deep eyes, and then go back inside. It was as if to say, "I don't want to leave you now." She began to wonder if he was sick. She took him to the vet, ran tests, and requested a full evaluation, but the doctor assured her that everything was fine physically. "He's healthy," the professional said. "Maybe it's just some emotional change." And that phrase echoed in her mind. Emotion, intuition, connection. Could that be it? Because everything in him seemed focused on her. The Shih Tzu had changed his own routine, habits, and tastes for her. It was as if he knew the moment demanded his full attention, that something was being born, not only within her body, but also within that invisible bond between them, a bond that only grew. She began to notice everything, the way he positioned himself next to her, the times he got up, and walked around the house, even the pauses he took to listen. Listen to the silence. It was very unusual behavior, and she, even without fully understanding it, began to respect this new rhythm of his. She stopped forcing walks. She stopped insisting on food. She just stayed there, present, like he did with her. And that's when he realized maybe that Shih Tzu wasn't being weak or cunning. Maybe he was simply feeling something humans take longer to realize, something that, very soon, would make everything make sense. Her Shih Tzu had never been much of a barker. He was one of those calm, sociable dogs who wagged his tail at anyone new who came through the door. Visitors were greeted with jumps and licks, with no sign of aggression. But in the last few days, something had changed drastically, and this change began to frighten even those who knew him well. It all started subtly. A family friend dropped by for a quick visit. When she entered the house, the Shih Tzu didn't rush to greet her as usual. He stood still between his owner and the visitor and began to growl softly. A low sound, as if to say, "Don't come any closer." She thought it was strange, but assumed it was just a moment of jealousy. After all, he was very attached to her. But in the following days, it happened again. Whenever someone tried to approach, be it a friend, a relative, or even her husband, the dog would change his behavior. He'd bark louder. He'd stand between the person and his owner. Sometimes he'd stand in front of her body like a small living barrier, his chest puffed out and his gaze fixed. It wasn't anger. It was protection, pure and clear. And it didn't stop there. In some situations, all it took was for someone to take a step toward her for him to react. He'd bark, prick up his ears, and thrust his body forward as if to say, "Not here." It was a completely new and intense behavior. Something inside him was triggering a very strong defense instinct, and she couldn't explain why. One of the most memorable scenes was when she was sitting on the couch and a cousin came to hug her goodbye. As soon as the cousin approached, the Shih Tzu jumped onto her owner's lap, barked loudly, and placed his paws on her chest. It was quick but firm. He didn't want anyone to touch him. Then he lay down on her belly as if to say, "She's my responsibility now." The family's reaction was immediate. "What happened to that dog?" they asked. "Is he aggressive?" But she, observing closely, knew it wasn't aggression. It was an emotional shift, a protective instinct that appeared out of nowhere, or rather from somewhere she didn't yet fully understand. And as strange as it was, she wasn't afraid. She felt safe. Because every time he reacted, she noticed he wasn't angry. He was attentive, caring, choosing the moments to intervene. And almost always, it was when she felt most tired, most sensitive, or most vulnerable. There was something there. Something he felt. Something he knew. And she began to realize that every bark, every movement, was a way for him to communicate that he was there for her. That he was protecting not just his body, but something bigger. Something new. Something even she hadn't understood yet. She began to trust that behavior, to respect that change. And deep down, she began to sense that perhaps that Shih Tzu was more connected to the truth than anyone else around. He wasn't just barking, he was guarding a secret that would soon be revealed. This was, without a doubt, the most mysterious change of all. Of all the new behaviors the Shih Tzu had begun to display, this was the one that most intrigued his owner. He wouldn't stop sniffing her belly. It was always there. Not her arm, nor her foot, nor her face. It was her belly. Every day, several times a day. At first, she thought it was a coincidence. Maybe he'd just picked up on something unusual. After all, dogs have a very keen sense of smell. But the behavior began to repeat itself so specifically that it was no longer possible to pretend it was a coincidence. He'd approach slowly, put his nose on her belly, take a long sniff, and then stay there. Still, silently, as if listening, as if waiting for a response. She began to observe more closely. It was always in the same place. And it wasn't a quick sniff, like dogs do when they want to identify something. It was almost a ritual. He would sniff, then lay his head there, silent, his eyes slowly closing, as if that were the safest spot in the world. One night, while she was watching a movie on the couch, he climbed up and calmly nuzzled her belly. He stayed there for several minutes. Then, without warning, he let out a deep sigh and lay down on top of her. He fell asleep right there, heavy, peaceful, as if he'd found the perfect place to rest. And somehow, she too felt at peace in that moment. A peace she didn't understand, but felt nonetheless. She began to notice that this happened mainly when she was most tired. On days when she felt more sensitive, he seemed to notice before she did. He'd come closer, smell her belly, lie down. And within minutes, everything felt lighter. As if that simple gesture were a way to balance everything going on inside her, including what she didn't yet know. That's when she remembered a story she'd read online months earlier. A woman said her dog started acting differently, and sometime later she discovered she was pregnant. At the time, she thought it was cute, but far from reality. Now, with her own Shih Tzu acting so similarly, that thought began to haunt her mind. Could he be feeling something I don't know yet? Does such a strong connection really exist? She didn't know, but something inside her was starting to believe. She tried to test it. She caressed other parts of his body, offered her lap, turned onto her side. But he always returned to her belly. Always. No matter the position or the time. It was as if something there was calling his attention. Something invisible, but real. That routine became a small ritual between them. Every night, before bed, he would climb into bed, settle himself on her belly, and stay there. She, even though she didn't understand, accepted it. Because deep down, she no longer found it strange. She thought it was necessary. She thought it was right. And even without a word being exchanged, there was a silent conversation going on there. A secret between her and that little four-legged guardian. A secret that, little by little, was beginning to make sense. The nights, which were once peaceful, began to change. The owner had always been a sound sleeper. She slept well, without interruptions, and the Shih Tzu always respected that. He knew when it was time to rest. He slept in his own little bed, or in the corner of the bed, without making a sound. He was the perfect companion even in the silence of the early morning. But then, something changed. Suddenly, he started waking her up. At first, she thought it was a coincidence. Maybe he was thirsty, or had heard a strange noise. But no, it was constant. Always between 2 and 4 in the morning. And always the same way. He would climb into bed, gently approach, and begin nudging her with his paw. He would gently touch her arm or lick her cheek. Then he would sit near her belly and stay there, just watching. She would wake up half asleep, not understanding. She would ask, "What's wrong, my love?" But he didn't bark. He didn't ask for food. He didn't want to leave. He just stayed there, watching. And after a few minutes, he would lie down again, his nose pressed against the same spot as always, her belly. At first, she was worried. Was he in pain? She took him to the vet again. Everything was normal. No pain, no physical discomfort. The doctor assured her, he's healthy. So why this behavior? Always in the early hours of the morning. Little by little, she began to notice a pattern. He only woke her when she was very restless. On nights when she dreamed too much, moved too much, or woke in a cold sweat, he was there. It was as if he sensed she wasn't well, as if to say, "Wake up, just a little, breathe, I'm here." And it worked, because every time he woke her like this, something inside her calmed, her heart slowed, her breathing steadied, and she fell back to sleep peacefully. It was as if he were caring not just for her body, but for her soul, a silent caregiver in the early morning. There was one night, in particular, that she never forgot. She'd had a powerful nightmare, the kind that leaves you tense awake. When she opened her eyes before she even realized where she was, there he was, sitting still, staring straight at her. He didn't bark. He just placed his paw on her arm as if to say, "I know, it's over." She cried, and he just lay down, nuzzling her belly once more. From that day on, she no longer cared about his awakenings. She accepted that somehow he was feeling something she couldn't perceive. Maybe it was her body changing. Maybe it was her heart. Maybe it was another life growing inside. Something invisible to the eye, but clearly detectable by that attentive Shih Tzu. And so, the early mornings took on a new meaning. She no longer placed her pillow so close to the edge of the bed. She left space for him. She knew that, at some point in the night, he would climb in. He would come closer and touch her soul with that quiet, firm, loving way of his. She still didn't know exactly what was going on inside her, but she knew for sure that she wasn't alone, because that little dog who woke her up for no reason actually had the best motive of all, to protect her, the way only he knew how. If there was one thing the Shih Tzu loved more than treats, it was going for walks. All it took was the sound of his leash being pulled from the drawer and he'd run off, tail wagging, twirling with joy. It was his favorite moment of the day, the scent of the street, the quick steps on the sidewalk, the wind in his face. Nothing excited that dog more than walk time. Until, suddenly, he stopped. The first time was strange. She grabbed his leash as usual, calling him with that cheerful tone that always worked, but he didn't move. He sat still, in the corner of the room, looking at her with that steady gaze. There was no fear, no sadness, just refusal. She insisted. "Come on, baby." She waved the leash in the air, clapped her hands, but nothing. He stood up, took a few steps toward her and came back. He lay down again, as if to say, "Not today." She thought it was an exception. Maybe he was tired. Maybe the heat was bothering him. But the next day, it happened again. And the day after that. No matter how hard she tried, he wouldn't leave. It was as if something inside him told him it wasn't time to leave, that his place was here, close to her, inside the house. This change began to worry her. She thought about pain in her paws, some discomfort. But again, the vet found nothing wrong. No pain, no physical problems. Everything indicated the Shih Tzu was healthy. But emotionally, there was something there. And it was easy to see. When she tried to get ready to go out alone, he'd start following her. He'd lie down in front of the door. When she came back from the street, he'd run up to her, smell her belly, and fidget for a while, as if checking everything was okay. If other people suggested taking him for a walk, he wouldn't accept. He only wanted to go out with her. And even then, only if she was okay. One day, while she was putting on her sneakers, he climbed onto the couch and placed his nose in her lap. He didn't make a sound, didn't bark. He just stood there, staring. She understood. She took off her sneakers, sat beside him, and remained silent. At that moment, he didn't need words. It was clear. He didn't want to leave. He didn't want to be distracted. He wanted to stay there, with her, close, protecting, feeling. And the strangest thing, it was precisely on the days when she felt most tired, most confused, that he refused to leave. When her body was crying out for rest, he seemed to know. When she said nothing but thought 1,000 things, he seemed to listen, as if he heard what she couldn't even say. That's when she understood. It wasn't laziness. It was instinct. It was care. It was silent love. The walk lost its meaning because what mattered to him was presence. It was connection. It was ensuring that nothing, not even a few minutes on the street, would take him away from her in that moment. And little by little, she began to accept it. She no longer insisted. When he didn't want to leave, she stayed too. She turned on the TV, grabbed a blanket, and invited him to lie down with her. And he did. Happy, satisfied, as if to say, "This is where I needed to be. It's always been here." Until then, everything she'd observed seemed to make sense only within the house. It was an intimate, silent, almost secret feeling between her and the Shih Tzu. But as the weeks passed, other people began to notice. Visitors, family, friends, everyone began commenting on how the dog's behavior had visibly changed. "He's acting strange, isn't he?" a friend said as she arrived for afternoon coffee. "He's quiet, different." "Didn't he usually play with his ball at this time?" asked her mother, surprised to see the toy forgotten in the corner of the room. Even the brother-in-law, who had always had little contact with the animal, commented, "He's watching you. He's a bit of a guardian, isn't he?" The owner was already accustomed to those reactions, but hearing it from others made her feel even more intrigued. It was as if what she was feeling inside was now being confirmed by those on the outside. People were seeing what she had been noticing every day, that something in her had awakened. And it wasn't just the adults. A little niece, just 5 years old, walked into the room, looked at the Shih Tzu lying next to her belly, and said, "Auntie, is he taking care of your belly?" She laughed and swallowed hard. There was no big belly yet, nor had she said anything about possible changes. But that simple, innocent sentence struck like a spark. A child, understanding nothing about pregnancy or canine instinct, had grasped something no one had said out loud. It was at that moment that she felt a chill, as if everything was connecting. The protection, the looks, the smells, the nighttime, awakenings, the refusal to go out. Everything seemed to point in a single direction. And now, even those who lived with her were noticing. At a family dinner, her brother tried to hug her goodbye, and the Shih Tzu quickly stood between them, growling softly. Everyone laughed, but she noticed the tension in his eyes. It wasn't a joke. He was attentive, watchful. "Is this dog now a private security guard?" someone joked. But she knew it was more than that. It was as if he knew he needed to keep people at a distance, that there was something there, growing, forming, and it needed to be protected. Even the vet, during a routine checkup, commented, "He's clinging to you more, isn't he?" This is very common in dogs who notice hormonal changes in their owners. They sense it before we even know it. That phrase echoed in her head. Before we even know it. That was exactly it. The Shih Tzu had sensed something she hadn't yet confirmed. But now everything was becoming clearer. Her body was changing. She was different. And he knew. He knew with a certainty that didn't need tests or words. It was pure instinct speaking louder. And the most beautiful thing about all of this was seeing how he didn't change on a whim. He changed out of care. He changed out of love. He adapted to her, shaped his own routine, changed his behavior, all to be closer, to protect, to warn, to love in the purest way possible. And with so many people noticing, she could no longer pretend it was just her imagination. It was happening. She hadn't said it out loud yet, but the Shih Tzu was already screaming with action. Something was coming, and he was ready to be a part of it. Until then, all attention had been focused on the Shih Tzu. Her behavior had changed so clearly, so strikingly, that it occupied her owner's thoughts daily. But what she hadn't yet noticed, or perhaps was ignoring, was that something was also happening to her. Something silent, discreet, but real. Her body was beginning to show signs. And the curious thing is that the Shih Tzu seemed to have noticed it before she did. It all started with a different kind of fatigue. It wasn't the usual everyday fatigue caused by work, rushing around, or sleepless nights. It was a kind of fatigue that came out of nowhere. Sometimes after a restful night, she would wake up feeling like she'd run a marathon. Her body craved more rest. Her eyes felt heavy, and even simple tasks seemed to require more effort than usual. And that wasn't all. Little things started to bother her. Smells, sounds, tastes. Things that had previously gone unnoticed now caught her attention. A light perfume seemed too strong. The noise of the television was irritating. Her favorite food no longer sat as well. Everything was different. Her emotions were also more raw. Movies that used to make her smile now made her cry. Emotional advertisements brought tears to her eyes. And strangely enough, she found herself crying for no reason, looking at the Shih Tzu lying silently beside her. It was as if everything inside her was more sensitive, more exposed. And it was precisely at these times that he was always nearby. The Shih Tzu seemed to sense her every mood swing. When she sat pensive, he would slowly come over and nuzzle her leg. When she cried, he would climb onto the sofa, lie on her lap, and sit there silently. He didn't have to do anything, he just stayed. And that was enough. She began to connect the dots. His tired body, his mild nausea, his intense emotions, and his behavior, which had been different for weeks. It was as if, somehow, he was trying to help her see what was happening inside her, as if he were saying, "Pay attention, listen to what your body is telling you." But she still had doubts. She didn't want to rush into things. She thought it might just be stress, or maybe some passing hormonal fluctuation. Still, she couldn't ignore the fact that the dog seemed to know. What's more, he seemed to be following each step of this change with a care that went beyond the norm. There was one morning in particular when she woke with a sense of peace. The sun was streaming through the window, the air was fresh, and she felt something different, as if she were beginning to understand. She got up slowly, and when she looked down at the floor, she saw her Shih Tzu already awake. Sitting up, looking at her with that deep, serene gaze. It was as if to say, "You're realizing it now, right?" And she was. She was beginning to feel like this wasn't just a phase, that there was something new inside her, a silent transformation. And he knew. He'd always known. It wasn't just her who was different. It was the whole world around her, slowly changing. And he was there to guide every step. It was a quiet morning, one of those when everything seems too normal, when she sat on the sofa with a cup of tea and felt her heart pounding for no apparent reason. Her Shih Tzu, as always, was there. Lying at her feet, his eyes closed but his body alert. And in that moment, something flashed through her mind, an old memory, something she'd read months ago, maybe even over a year ago, which at the time seemed like just a pleasant curiosity. It was one of those stories shared on social media with a catchy title, "Dog Discovers Pregnancy Before Owner." She remembered reading it and finding it sweet. A dog who started acting differently, following his owner around the house, sniffing her belly frequently. And only later did she discover she was expecting a baby. At the time, she read it, smiled, shared it with a friend, and moved on. She never imagined something so similar could happen to her. But now, all the signs were there, repeated, clear, before her eyes and in her heart. The Shih Tzu was acting exactly like the dog in the story. What's more, he'd been doing it for weeks, before any physical signs, before any real suspicion, before any doubt arose in her mind. He already knew. The persistent smell in her belly, the sleepless nights, the overprotectiveness, the worried look, the refusal to go for walks, the watchful silence, it all fit together. And now, her own body was giving clues. The emotions, the fatigue, the sensitivity, the small bouts of nausea. It was as if every detail was trying to push her toward the truth, and that Shih Tzu was the clearest messenger of all. She stood frozen for a few seconds, remembering that simple reading that had previously been nothing more than an internet curiosity. And now it was a mirror of her own life. The teacup trembled slightly in her hand. Her heart was beating fast. Her gaze was lost for a few seconds, fixed on the living room wall as the realization began to sink in. At that moment, the Shih Tzu stood up, took a short turn, and climbed onto the couch. He settled down beside her, nuzzling her belly once more. And he stayed. No sound, no fuss, just present. That was enough. She looked at him and whispered, "You already know, right?" He didn't answer, of course, but he didn't need to. His silence spoke louder than any words. Her thoughts racing, she began to consider the idea of testing it. A chill ran down her spine. She didn't want to rush into things, but she couldn't ignore it any longer. Everything pointed to this. And of all the clues, the strongest was that little dog who, from the very beginning, had changed his entire routine to stay close to her, as if protecting something precious. It was a strange sensation, half doubt, half certainty. But there was an invisible thread connecting it all. Animal behavior, intuition, body signals, and now, memories. Memories that seemed to have been stored in the back of my mind just to be accessed at that exact moment. She took a deep breath. She knew she didn't have all the answers yet, but she also knew something big was happening. And that, as confusing as it was, she wasn't alone. There was a furry, four-legged heart that had already figured it all out, before her. She spent the rest of the day with her head spinning. She couldn't concentrate on anything anymore. Every time she looked at the Shih Tzu, it was as if he were waiting for something from her. He followed her around the house, sat nearby, and watched silently. It was as if his gaze was saying, "Go on, confirm what I already know." The thought hammered. What if it is? What if he's right? She tried to rationalize. Maybe it's just a coincidence. Maybe he's just more needy. But her heart didn't believe that explanation, because deep down, she was already feeling it too. Her body was sending signals, and the Shih Tzu only reinforced each one with his insistent, caring, protective behavior. The next morning, she woke up feeling determined. She put on comfortable clothes, said good morning to her Shih Tzu, who was lying, as usual, beside her bed, and left without making a fuss. She went to the pharmacy, bought a pregnancy test, and returned silently, her heart beating faster than ever. The Shih Tzu greeted her at the door, wagging his tail slightly, but without his usual excitement. He simply looked her in the eye and followed her into the bedroom. He sat beside the bed and remained, in silence. She walked into the bathroom with the test in her hands. Her legs trembled a little. It was as if everything was about to change. Minutes later, when she saw the result, she stopped. She took a deep breath, and the world went silent. The test was positive. She smiled, her eyes brimming with tears. She couldn't say anything. She just walked slowly out of the bathroom and looked at the Shih Tzu. He was still sitting there. When he saw her, he got up, walked over to her, nuzzled her belly, and lay down, unhurriedly, as if to say, "I told you so." And in that moment, she knew. He knew. All along,